Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. This video is the next in a series looking at the financial implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the global economy. And without a shadow of a doubt, that war has had the single biggest impact on the global economy out of any event over the last 12 months. We've seen commodity prices rising and then falling. We've seen changes to the global supply chain. We've seen companies exiting Russia. We've seen the majority of Europe and the West banning the purchase of oil and gas and other essential energy items from Russia, forcing them to have to pay more from other countries for those supplies. So this has been an absolute disaster for the global economy. And one of the things that we all need for the global economy to get back on track is for this war to come to a conclusion, some form of settlement that works for all parties so that we can go back to an element of normality. And this week we have seen two key speeches. The first one given by President Putin in Moscow, his State of the Nation address that was given to 1,400 people. And shortly after that, President Biden of the USA gave a speech in Poland as part of the tour that he's on, whereby he visited Ukraine first and now he's gone to Poland. So in today's episode, I want to go through the key issues that were raised in both of those speeches to evaluate exactly where both parties are, talk about whether or not there's any light at the end of the tunnel in terms of getting a resolution for this war, and then talk about what the likely implications of what's been said are for the global economy over the course of the next 3 to 6 months. So before we get started on all of that, I'd like to ask you for a thumbs up at some point during this video if you're enjoying the content. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I always include chapters, so if you don't have time to watch everything, you can pick and choose what you'd like to see. And if you'd like to support the channel, please have a look below where you'll find links to YouTube Super Thanks and membership, as well as Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon. And as always, I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone that has supported the channel. Genuinely appreciate it. As I mentioned at the start of the video, the war in Ukraine has been going on for almost a year now, and President Putin gave his State of the Nation address, which was broadcast live across the whole of Russia. And this was his opportunity to explain to the world why the war started and what Russia's current position is. So let's firstly have a look at what he had to say with regards to why Russia invaded Ukraine.
The responsibility for starting the conflict, for growing number of victims, lies totally with the West and with Kiev regime, for whom Ukrainian people are not their own, effectively. This regime is not serving their national interests, they're serving interests of foreign powers. Ukraine is now like a training ground for them. I'm not going to talk about the plans of Western powers to increase military aid. Everyone knows about this. But one thing is very clear to everyone. The greater the range of these systems, the further away we will be forced to move the threat from our borders.
So what he's just said there is firstly that the responsibility for this war lies firmly in the hands of the West. So he's blaming the West entirely for this happening. And he's pointing the finger at the Ukrainian authorities, saying that they're not actually representing the rights of the Ukraine people. They're basically acting as a puppet for the West, and the West are using this as a training ground for their military exercises. So he's essentially implying that Russia is going in to protect the people of Ukraine against the West and the Ukrainian authorities. And that's why they had to start the war. So I think what we're seeing here is a narrative that's saying that the people of Ukraine are basically part of the wider Russian Empire, and that the Russian forces had to go in to liberate them against the oppressive regime that was being applied against them by the Ukrainian authorities, who were acting on behalf of the West. But the bottom line message here is that Russia didn't actually start this war. They were going in to defend the people of Ukraine against the oppressive regime. Now, the speech that President Putin gave was almost 2 hours long, and he covered off a number of different topics. And he made a bizarre reference to paedophilia in the West, and also commented on some LGBTQ plus things that I thought would be interesting to look at.
Now look at what they're doing with their own peoples. They're destroying the institution of family, their cultural and historical identity, and various perversions with regard to children up to pedophilia are accepted as the new norm, and priests are forced to recognize and officiate same-sex weddings. People can live however they want, and we in Russia have never intruded into people's private life, and we're not going to do that. But what we want to say is maybe they should take a look in the scripture, into the holy book of any great religion. It says that the family is a union between woman and man. And these holy texts are now being increasingly doubted in the West. The Anglican Church is now considering the idea of a gender-neutral God. What can we say? God forgive them. They don't know what they're doing.
Okay, we've got some really interesting comments that have been made here. The first one is that paedophilia is the norm in the West. So that's indicating that everybody in the West is happy with regards to paedophilia. I don't know what that's based upon. There is no detail as to what he's talking about there, but this is obviously utter nonsense. I don't know even why it was raised, what the context is. Seems a very, very unusual thing for a world leader to raise at a conference that he's presenting to the whole of the nation. If I'm trying to work out some sort of rationale as to why that's been raised and why it's been presented almost as a fact, I think it's to discredit everybody in the West, to try to depict everybody in the West as evil, but I don't really know why he raised it. Now, the next point that he went on to raise is that a family is a marriage between a man and a woman, and that priests are being forced to officiate on same-sex marriages. Now, he then went on to say we're happy to let everybody live as they want to. We don't want to interfere. However, all of the rest of his comments were very disparaging about the LGBT plus Q community, so I don't really think there's a great deal of liberalism going on, certainly not at the top in Russia right now. And then the final point that he raised was about religion and the fact that in his mind, God is undoubtedly a man.
The elites of the West are not hiding their goals. They are, as they say, trying to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. What does that mean to us? That means they want to end with Russia. They want to turn a local conflict into a phase of global conflict. This is how we understand this. And we will react in an appropriate way. Because in this case, we're talking about existence of our country. They also have to take into account that it is impossible to defeat Russia on the battlefield.
So in this section of his speech, President Putin is saying that the West is turning what he deems to be a local conflict into a global conflict. And he believes that the West is not only trying to defeat Russia, but it wants to also end its existence. And what he said in the final part of that section is that it's impossible to defeat Russia on the battlefield. So this basically is throwing the gauntlet down to everybody, saying, you cannot beat us, we are unbeatable, we will fight to the death, and this war will carry on. So there is absolutely no sign of any sort of peace agreement or any end in sight to the fighting that's going on currently in Ukraine. And obviously that is really bad news for everybody involved in the conflict and also for the global economy.
One piece of news saved right for the end, that Russia would halt its obligations under the New START treaty, the last agreement still nominally in place to stop the proliferation of nuclear warheads.
So one of the final parts of President Putin's speech was that Russia has now suspended its participation in the New START treaty. And the New START treaty has been absolutely critical in ensuring that there's been no further deployment of nuclear weapons and no escalation towards any potential nuclear war. So whilst we're on this topic, let's have a look at some of the details of that New START treaty. One of Barack Obama's campaign objectives in 2008 was to work towards the goal of eliminating all nuclear weapons. And following prolonged negotiations with Russia, the New START treaty was signed in 2010 and came into force in February 2011. The treaty's main provisions are as follows. In terms of the number of warheads, Russia and the USA have agreed to have no more than 1,550 deployed strategic nuclear warheads. Warheads count as being deployed if they are loaded onto a missile that is then subsequently deployed, and in addition, one deployed warhead is counted for each deployed strategic bomber regardless of the actual number it carries. In terms of the delivery vehicles for those warheads, each side has agreed to have no more than 700 deployed intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, or strategic bombers. Missiles count as deployed if they're installed in a launcher. The number of deployed delivery vehicles is much less than the number of deployed warheads, as some missiles carry multiple warheads. There are no limits on missiles that are not deployed in launchers, however they may only be stored in restricted locations. And in terms of missile launchers, each side is allowed to have a maximum of 800 deployed and non-deployed launchers, plus deployed and non-deployed strategic bombers. A deployed launcher is a launcher containing a missile, a non-deployed launcher contains no missile. Missile silos, mobile missile launchers and submarine launch tubes each count as one launcher. A single submarine can have multiple launch tubes, and once again each strategic bomber counts as one launcher. A limited number of launchers used for testing or training purposes, those undergoing maintenance, as well as formerly operational launchers without missiles, count as non-deployed. In that case, they still count towards the total of 800 deployed and non-deployed launchers. Now, as a direct comparison, the new START limits are considerably lower than those set by previous agreements, including START 1, which limited the deployed strategic warheads to 6,000 per side, and deployed and non-deployed launchers to 1,600, and SORT, which restricted the number of warheads to 2,200. However, there was no limit in terms of the deployed and non-deployed launchers. Now, in terms of how New START is actually monitored, both sides agreed to transparency requirements, and the USA and Russia shared detailed information with one another on their strategic nuclear forces, including twice-yearly declarations on the number of deployed warheads and the numbers and locations of delivery vehicles and launchers, rolling notifications of the location and status of delivery vehicles and launchers, advanced notifications of treaty-accountable ballistic missile launchers, and it's reported that since 2011, over 20,000 such notifications have been exchanged. The sharing of data for up to 5 submarine-launched ballistic missile and intercontinental ballistic missile test flights per year, and declarations of new types of treaty-accountable weapons entering into service, and exhibition of such weapons for examination by the other party. In addition to this, both sides committed to not interfering with efforts to gather data, for example from satellites, on each other's nuclear forces, and each party has the right to 18 inspections a year, to include inspections such as the verification of the number of warheads on randomly selected deployed missiles and the number of non-deployed launchers. And just to finish off in this section, I thought you'd be interested to have a look at this graph, which shows the development in terms of the number of warheads dating back to 1945. Now, the thick blue line in this chart depicts the number of US warheads, the orange line depicts the number of Russian warheads, the dotted blue line shows US military spending as a percentage of GDP, and the dotted orange line shows Russian military spending as a percentage of their GDP. What you can see is that between 1955 and 1965, there was a huge increase in the number of US warheads, and the total got above 30,000 at one point. And of course, this was around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Cold War was at its height. And if you look at the shape of the Russian chart, it's actually very different. And the number of warheads increased steadily between 1960 and 1985, when it peaked at around 40,000. However, since that point, there has been an active move towards reducing the number of deployed warheads. And you can see that there's been a gradual reduction over the course of the last 30 years or so, as a number of these treaties have been agreed, and both sides have agreed to reduce the number of deployed warheads. Now, the speech that President Biden gave in Poland wasn't designed to be a direct response to what President Putin had said, but there was a lot of coverage of the war and the situation with regards from the USA and NATO's perspective. So let's hear what Joe Biden had to say with regards to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
You know, this has been an extraordinary year in every sense. Extraordinary brutality from Russian forces and mercenaries. They've committed depravities, crimes against humanity, without shame or compunction. They've targeted civilians with death and destruction, used rape as a weapon of war, stolen Ukrainian children in an attempt to steal Ukraine's future, bombed train stations, maternity hospitals, schools, and orphanages. No one can turn away their eyes from the atrocities Russia is committing against the Ukrainian people. It's abhorrent. It's abhorrent.
So Joe Biden has used some very strong words in this part of his speech, and he's put the blame firmly onto Russia with regards to this conflict.
1 year ago, the world was bracing for the fall of Kyiv. Well, I just come from a visit to Kyiv, and I can report Kyiv stands strong. Kyiv stands proud. It stands tall, and most important, it stands free. When Russia invaded, it wasn't just Ukraine being tested. The whole world faced a test for the ages. Europe was being tested. America was being tested. NATO was being tested. All democracies are being tested. And the questions we faced were as simple as they were profound. Would we respond? Or would we look the other way? Would we be strong? Or would we be weak? Would we, all of our allies, would be united or divided? 1 year later, we know the answer. We did respond. We would be strong. We would be united. And the world would not look the other way. We also face fundamental questions about the commitment to the most basic of principles. Would we stand up for the sovereignty of nations? Would we stand up for the right of people to live free from naked aggression? Would we stand up for democracy? 1 year later, we know the answers. Yes, we would stand up for sovereignty, and we did. Yes, we would stand up for the right of people to live free from aggression, and we did. And we would stand up for democracy, and we did.
So I think this part of the speech is really very interesting because firstly, he's saying that everybody has come together to support Ukraine. And this has now become a war against oppression and is a fight for freedom and democracy. So this really changes the perspective from what's considered to be a local conflict, as mentioned previously in President Putin's speech, to saying that this actually is supporting sovereignty, freedom against oppression. And of course, the reason that that's important is that these are principles that are difficult to walk away from. President Biden can't suddenly pull out of supporting Ukraine and say that actually we're no longer interested if it's a fight for democracy and freedom and sovereignty, because those principles are fundamental for world order.
If Ukraine stopped defending itself against Russia, it would be the end of Ukraine. That's why together we're making sure Ukraine can defend itself. The United States has assembled a worldwide coalition of more than 50 nations to get critical weapons and supplies to the brave Ukrainian fighters on the front lines. Air defense systems, artillery, ammunition, tanks, armored vehicles. The European Union and its member states have stepped up with unprecedented commitment to Ukraine, not just in security assistance, but economic and humanitarian refugee assistance and so much more.
Now, in terms of trying to get to the bottom of when this war is going to end, obviously the resources that are available to Ukraine are a key element. And what President Biden has said here is that more than 50 countries have come together and provided all sorts of different support, both military support and financial support and humanitarian support. And if Ukraine keeps receiving that support, then that means that it will be in a position to keep defending itself and to keep the war going. So I think this part of the speech is really quite important because it gives us a very strong indication that Ukraine are not going to run out of resources. They've got almost unlimited resources because all of these different countries will keep feeding them. So that means that it's very unlikely that we'll see a resolution in this war as a result of Ukraine running out of resources.
When President Putin ordered his tanks to roll into Ukraine, he thought we would roll over. He was wrong. The Ukrainian people are too brave. America, Europe, a coalition of nations from the Atlantic to the Pacific, we were too unified. Democracy was too strong. Instead of an easy victory he perceived and predicted, Putin left with burnout tanks and Russia's forces in disarray. He thought he'd get the Finlandization of NATO. Instead, he got the NATOization of Finland and Sweden. He thought NATO would fracture and divide. Instead, NATO is more united and more unified than ever before. He thought he could weaponize energy to crack your resolve, Europe's resolve. Instead, we're working together to end Europe's dependence on Russian fossil fuels. He thought autocrats like himself were tough and leaders of democracy were soft. And then he met the iron will of America and the nations everywhere that refused to accept the world governed by fear and force. President Putin is confronted with something today that he didn't think was possible a year ago. The democracies of the world have grown stronger, not weaker. But the autocrats of the world have grown weaker, not stronger.
Now, what Joe Biden has just said is really interesting. Firstly, he's reiterating the point that this is democracy against autocracy. So he's basically accusing Russia of being a dictatorship, even though they do have an election system in Russia. He's saying that Russia is an autocratic society. But the more important thing that he's mentioned here is NATO. And he actually at one point said that Finland and Sweden have now joined NATO, which if you follow the channel, you'll know that that's not actually correct, because Turkey have vetoed those applications and is subsequently still withholding its vote. And I think it's likely that it will be towards the end of this year that we'll see a resolution of those discussions. But it's interesting that Joe Biden raised NATO. He's talking about NATO here as if Ukraine is part of the NATO alliance, which it isn't. So this isn't actually a fight for NATO. A lot of the countries that are providing support to Ukraine are in NATO, so there is an overlap there, but this officially isn't a NATO fight right now. But the way that he's talking, he's implying that NATO is involved in this fight, when actually they officially are not. So in terms of when we're likely to see some form of resolution with regards to this conflict, let's hear what Joe Biden had to say at the end of his speech.
Appetites of the autocrat cannot be appeased. They must be opposed. Autocrats only understand one word: no, no, no. No, you will not take my country. No, you will not take my freedom. No, you will not take my future. And I'll repeat tonight what I said last year in the same place. A dictator bent on rebuilding an empire will never be able to ease the people's love of liberty. Brutality will never grind down the will of the free. And Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia. Never.
So there are a couple of really interesting points here. Firstly, he's referring to President Putin as a dictator who wants to expand his empire. But secondly, he's saying that Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia. So he's saying that there is no chance that Russia can win this war. And if we refer back to what President Putin said, he said that Russia will never be defeated in battle. So what we've got here are two entirely polar opposite views. The West are saying that Ukraine will never lose this war, and Russia are saying that it's impossible to defeat Russia in battle. So the only real hope that we've all got right now is that there will be some form of peace agreement signed at some point in the future. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video really to give you the latest information that's being provided by the two most important leaders with regards to this conflict. Now, President Putin's come out and made a variety of different statements. Firstly, he's saying that the West started this conflict through their actions and control of the authorities in Kyiv, and that Russia was essentially forced to go in to save all of the people of Ukraine. He then went on to say that Russia would never be defeated in battle, and that they will never back down against this foreign aggressor. So he's basically saying that Russia will never end this war and that they will never be defeated. However, most concerningly of all, he then went on to state that Russia are now pulling out of the New START nuclear weapon treaty, which means that they're no longer agreeing to limit the number of warheads that they're deploying in various locations, and that they won't allow the US to go in and check what's going on and to be able to do an audit of where all those missiles are. And these comments with regards to the New START agreement really follow up on some of the other comments that President Putin has made over the course of the last 12 months, that he is prepared to use any means necessary to defend Russia. And that means that potentially we've got this concept of nuclear war raising its ugly head once more. Now, in terms of the response from President Biden, he's come out and placed the blame for this war firmly on the shoulders of Russia. He's accusing Russia of a variety of war crimes. He's then gone on to talk about the war in terms of democracy and sovereignty and freedom against dictatorship. He talked about the significant resources that have been provided so far to Ukraine, and the fact that none of these nations are going to walk away from this support, and that Ukraine will not lose a war to Russia. So essentially what we've got is two opposing views, which tells us that this war could go on for many more years yet. We're coming up to the 1-year anniversary. Let's hope we don't have a 5 or 10-year anniversary for this war, because as I mentioned at the start of the video, this is the single worst thing for the global economy. The more this war goes on, and the more we see a split in terms of the way the world is operating, the worse it's going to get. Because effectively what we're seeing here is the creation of a new Cold War. We thought we'd got rid of the Cold War towards the end of the 90s when we saw the breakup of the Soviet Union. However, we're now seeing a new Cold War forming, and the big question now is who will be on the east side of the East-West divide. At the moment it's only Russia. However, Russia are currently trying to get closer to countries such as Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, China, India. So if we do see some of these countries teaming up with Russia and joining forces, effectively what we may well see is a creation of a new Soviet Union. They won't actually be linked by land, but some of these countries may decide that they want to get into bed with Russia, to do more commerce with Russia, to build up their military relations, and effectively form a new bloc which would be against the West. And if you take a step back from that arrangement and exclude all of the military and the conflict side of things, when you look at things from an economic point of view, that's going to be bad news for the global economy. The global economy works best when everybody works together, because certain countries are specialists in certain things. Countries have valuable resources that they want to trade with other nations. And if you start cutting off some of those trading relationships, that means that either the countries that have been cut off are going to have to pay a lot more for those goods, or they simply won't have access to them at all. And that will limit development and opportunity and will cause inflation all around the world. And as you'll know if you follow the channel, inflation is usually combated by rising interest rates. And when interest rates go up, that increases the cost of borrowing, reduces the amount of money that everybody has, and generally reduces spending, which then means that GDP contracts. And a result of all of this will be a slowdown in the global economy. So as I said right at the start of this video, the war in Ukraine has had the single biggest impact on the global economy, and it's all been negative. And the longer it goes on, the longer that negative impact will continue. And unfortunately, what we've seen today is that the leaders of the two biggest nations involved in this battle are both saying that they're prepared to carry on for as long as it takes, and that they will throw unlimited resources at this, and that they will not be defeated. So as it stands right now, there is no end in sight for this war, which is really bad news for the global economy. So hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and thought-provoking. That's why I'm making these videos. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up, and thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end.